All righty. Hello, everyone. It's the 27th of June, and this is This and That. Um, if you've sort of been following along, you'll note that I've been looking at various ways in which we can talk about things like surplus value, how we got there, and we know we've learned, I hope, that it comes not simply because of profit or a certain type of additional value beyond what it takes to reproduce something. Rather, it is something a little bit more than that. And it's unfortunately not quite so visible because it is capital after all. But it's also value in the sense that it has some thing about it that allows it to be manipulated and to result in differences, inequality, at least in wealth terms, but also simply in quality terms in a much larger sort of sense. There are relative versions of value. There are absolute versions of value, which are not necessarily identical to surplus value. Surplus value is culled from that. And it is activated at scale, usually a small enterprise, an individual enterprise, for example. Kind of hard to see where the surplus value is. It really only comes from being in a kind of social set, a set of relationships in groups or communities or larger units like that. And the bigger it gets, the bigger the problem or the inequality can be. And it necessitates a kind of growth. That is, it requires circulation. It's not only just, you can produce surplus value because it comes from the production process, but its kind of location only becomes manifest when it's kind of distributed, when it's circulated. And so it has this scale element to it, and it also has that, and the scale is also spatial and temporal in the sense that it requires multiple moments or time periods, perhaps. It's a kind of unfolding that occurs in turnover. And the example that's been used so far is the difference between an annual turnover period and some shorter turnover period that is monthly or quarterly or whatever. And you can see that there are certain contingencies that happen that are necessary, that are required, that you're not going to get quite so much surplus value in a pre-capitalist organization. That is, under feudalism, there's some surplus value, but pretty much, it's a relatively smaller scale activity. There's certainly plenty of them, but their tendency is to be much more autonomous or relatively autonomous and isolated. And so capitalism requires a much larger sort of network effect, as it were, amongst those things. That being said, it's, I think, important to think in ways in which you can characterize that degree of abstraction. So we've talked at the beginning about concrete things that are actual, things that are more like usable, palpable, present. But there's a variety of other things that are slightly more a part of a kind of expansion. And the expansion is both concrete, but the expansion is also abstract. It comes because the act of exchange itself is not as quite as palpable, requires multiple agents usually, or as I've said, a kind of a larger scale that is more people, more space, more transportation, or whatever. The scale changes, and thereby a certain set of abstract elements. And so underneath that, we talked about the difference between actual labor and labor power, which is a kind of more, as I said, less concrete, more abstract, more ephemeral. And labor power is not something that kind of you can see in front of you, but rather it is labor power is a way in which you can talk about the expectations, sort of an expected value in that sense. So what I needed was an idea that would connect all those things, because describing it is always difficult. So I'm picking a specific way of talking about it, and there is literature for it. It manifests itself in a variety of arenas. It is also semiotic, but you could do a discussion of it without talking about signs or sign systems. It's the whole idea of semiotics in that sense is that, as scientific as it might be, it doesn't have to dominate our discourse, even though from a teaching point of view, if you use semiotics in your pedagogy, and if you're good at it, you can get it to work in a kind of interesting way. And it can allow you to have a certain kind of power over your analysis. Now, whether it makes your production of things better, that's a different question. Because something like, for example, indexing or indexicality, which exists in a variety of disciplines, is always something that's hard. It's just more difficult to deal with because it requires, and you don't want to privilege it by saying higher level thinking, but you do want to think in a way that connects things together. Let's put it that way. I mean, I have a whole separate lecture on how to do that, but it is this way of looking at different kinds of things and getting your audience, as it were, the receivers of your information, to do a little work and to cognitively sort of assemble stuff. Now that sounds all very mechanical and structural, but that is the thing about structure. That is the thing. I mean, we could talk about it in a very spiritual way, like zeitgeist and gestalt, and we can use all those kind of terms, but that doesn't really get us anywhere. I mean, it's great in terms of talking about expression, and if you were doing psychoanalysis or something, you could sort of work through that, but it doesn't get us to the point of where we could do cultural or political or social critique. It's much harder to do it from using terms, more generalizable terms like that, universals like that particular type, that is archetypes or whatever. Rather, I think it's on the other side of this is a much more structural or sort of post-structural thing. And I'm glad that the literature still discusses it, even though it's not as well thought out as I would certainly expect. But then again, had I more power or whatever, I could probably have influenced the direction of this a little bit. But in America, there are it is the difference between America and Europe. The teaching system in America, because of its modeling, essentially on a capitalist model, has always sort of short-circuited ways in which you could analyze it, because it keeps on sort of de-skilling people, de-skilling the educated, which is why we're having that debate tonight. Anyway, so I've been interested in the idea of the index. The index is one of three things divided by Charles Sanders Peirce as, sort of icon index and symbol. That's the easy way to talk about it. Peirce is really much more crazy than that. And if you read anything about Charles Sanders Peirce, you probably would go in two directions. In one direction, if you were looking at Charles Sanders Peirce, the philosopher, well, he's more than a philosopher. He did all kinds of crap. I mean, he did stuff in telecommunications. He did stuff on, I think, lighthouses. I can't remember. He did a whole bunch of different things. He's a pretty wacky guy and never got a Nobel Prize, blah, 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 blah. But another one of those people, I think, who's really important for the 20th century. So anyway, I'll go through them. I have slides today, so you'll see lots of slides today. But the point I was trying to make is, how is it that we could talk about value, particularly surplus value? How do we get there? We can get there in terms of talking about a kind of system of things that is, there's systems of labor power there, and you know it because there are all these people there, and you know of that labor power in the context we were talking about yesterday, because there are all these people pressing buttons on their little computers or cell phones or whatever, smartphones, and creating the algorithm. So the algorithm does have labor power built into it. Now, identifying the quality and quantity of that labor power is very different, but it is there. And I think you can see how it's been manipulated in things like NFTs or cryptocurrency. It is there. So anyway, so I've introduced some terms. I've suggested that surplus value is more dynamic than it is static, and that's the general position I think that I would generally subscribe to in terms of talking about anything that is Marxist, dialectical materialist, or whatever, is that it's very difficult to talk about it in a static, small-scale way. You have to talk about it in a larger, or something approaching large scale. The problem, of course, is that it's not purely large or purely small. It is a combination of those things. And yet, some Marxists will only look at macroeconomic elements. They really don't like getting into the microeconomic, the dirty details of the foundation, because it has other problematic elements. That is, it can devolve to certain type of behavioralism or methodological individualism or something. The individual and turn into a thing about individual choices, and it's really less about individuals and really more about the structures of things and other issues related to agency. But there are other qualities or contingencies built into talking about that. And so when Marx talks about annihilating space, whenever you annihilate space, you're also making a temporal change of some kind. Marx doesn't talk enough about that, but he does. And in volume 2, which is what we've been kind of looking at, and we're going to review that in the context of Weekly Marx by sort of reviewing together the Higginbottom lectures to sort of see this is how capital is structured. We're looking at volume 2, but you have to see its relation to volume 1 and volume 3. And that's what Higginbottom has presented, is that you can't you can sort of move through it, but at every moment you're still referring to the total thing, and that's nicely dialectic. It also requires a certain broader way of thinking. So yesterday I introduced Formula 6 by Dantas. It looks complicated. It's got little arrows and dashed lines and all kinds of shit there, but it does have labor power issues that are both paid and unpaid, which is an important combination. Because its relation to wages is problematic at the get-go, right? Paid work has wages. Unpaid work, unpaid labor, there are no wages. And, that's kind of you punching buttons on your smartphone. You're not being paid for that. I mean, probably you should be. And in terms of clickbait, et cetera, somebody may be getting paid from it, but it is not fully reconcilable in that way. That is, remuneration doesn't occur. So I introduced this, which is the sort of fairly complete kind of model that Dantas presents. He has certain other kinds of articles that include that. I include a little drawing here. Don't worry about it so much. It is so similar to all the other little things we've been looking at, and has the a Venn diagram and a certain reference to discourse and territory. And it represents something that's a little on the edge. And we will come back to this eventually if people will stick around, but it does deal with a certain idea about signs and territories, and is sort of extension of the work of folks who are interested in the readings of Deleuze and Guattari, which, it's dated in that particular sense, but it is still influential. It still affects a lot of thinking about things, and as I hope that you've appreciated, that it is an extension of it is in a line of thinking that goes all the way back to the 19th century. It still is about Marx ultimately. So anyway, all of that put together, you can see these fields brought together: semiotics, linguistics, anthropology, and philosophy of language. Indexicality is the phenomenon of a sign pointing to or indexing some element in the context in which it occurs. Now, that sounds very different than the index funds that Feldo was talking about, but it's similar in the sense that an index is not the thing itself, or a sum or a summary, and it's not kind of an average or a mean or something else. Indexes give a much larger kind of generalization, and in that sense, with respect to money, more sustainable. That is, an index fund is actually probably the safest thing to invest in if you're into stocks or whatever. Everything else is risk. So I've talked before about semiotics for over the years, and I unfortunately or fortunately haven't subjected you to the kind of the basic model, and I'm not going to do it now, but I will make some, what do these terms mean? And if you do graphic design at all, these are very useful. That is, there are things called icons, there are things called symbols, and there's this other thing, this third term or intermediate term called index. And I'll give you the definitions in a second. But imagine that an icon is like, for example, up to the upper left, that's the symbol for, I guess, male individual. That's, if that were on a bathroom, that's what it would be. A letter form, that is a symbol like M or WC, would be more symbolic as opposed to iconic. I mean, you could make them iconic, but they are symbolic in the sense that they sit in a coded system that requires you to understand the English language or the Western letter form, whatever. The index, however, is something intermediate because it requires you, as I was just yammering about a second ago, it requires you to do a little work. And that is to not only simply see the thing, but to make a sort of cognitive judgment. Like on your driver's test, they ask you, is the green on the bottom or on the top of your stoplights, which is really bad for people who are colorblind, right? So there are other issues at work. None of these are perfectly universal in that sense. A no smoking sign could be iconically a cigarette, a lit cigarette, but it's more indexical in the sense that not smoking also implies that where there's smoke, there's fire. And so a fire danger is also about the not smoking. So you have some indexicality there. Similarly, a thermometer it is on the one hand about temperature, but it is also about reading, that is reading the thermometer as well. Here's a different way of talking about it, an iconic representation. A car is an image which directly resembles the real thing. Iconography and iconology in churches, for example, historically Western medieval churches, is, you have icons for God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, for example. Some are literal, are more, palpable, and more purely iconic in that sense, representational, pictorial. Others are more symbolic. And so, for example, the Holy Spirit appears sometimes just as a bunch of rays of little flecks of gold or something, or clouds. Once we get to more realism, doves or birds represent the Holy Spirit. And so it's interesting to see how that sort of changes. And of course, representing God is even more problematic. Does he really look like Zeus? I don't think so. Now, so the symbolic is a sign that bears no obvious relation to the thing that is signified. So, for example, this is a stop sign, but it's a European stop sign, or at least, whatever, a non-American stop sign. And if you started putting these things up, we'd have a lot more accidents in this country. In the lower left is indexical. So an imprint, a shoe or a tire tread mark, it suggests the presence of the car. So you have actual cars in the iconic, you have something symbolic, which could mean a bunch of different things, and it's kind of hard to figure it out. Often requires a better integration of a cultural code. And indexical, which has some passing relationship, but it's not necessarily, I mean, it sort of represents car, but it represents tires as well, and it represents rolling, in fact, in an indexical way. So what I'm suggesting is that surplus value has a more a wider definition, let's put it that way. It's temporally and spatially, requires motion, movement, variety of other contingent elements. And so it's not all there at once. So that's kind of what I mean by, and I've suggested that Charles Sanders Peirce, yes, that's how it's pronounced, index or indexical sign is 3 elements, similar to what we were just talking about above. That is, how is it that we signify vehicles? You can do it in a variety of ways. And one way is to have signifier above that is a tire track. And what it's referring to is that a vehicle was here. So you need all 3 of these elements actually to do an indexical sign. So the indexical sign can have these 3 sub-elements to make to tell you that something about cars. So here's Peirce's definition of the triadic sign relation. And Peirce is about logic. The whole point is that it's a logical system. It's a way of talking about any or everything. It is about language as well. It is a little hermetic, that is sort of a self-contained. It is problematic in that sense, because if you Peirce has, there are 10 sort of basic sign categories, but ultimately there's 400 plus sign possibilities, and it's mathematically a little nuts. And very few people actually try to manipulate it. But you're just sitting there trying to figure these things out. And God knows why all of his papers are sitting in Indianapolis, but that's where they are. Namely, a sign is something A, which brings something B, its interpretant sign, determined or created by it, into the same sort of correspondence with something, C, its object, as that in which itself stands to see. So this, and I'm not going to go at great length about it because that would take a long time, but indexicality represents that kind of set of relations. The index asserts nothing, it only says there. And in linguistics, if you point to something and say there or over there or here or whatever, that's a kind of indexical expression. It takes hold of our eyes, as it were, and forcibly directs them to a particular object, and there it stops. Demonstrative and relative pronouns are merely pure indices because they denote things without describing them. And so are the letters on a geometrical diagram. I've just shown you some. And the subscript letters in which algebra distinguish one value from another without saying what those values are. So T sub P, T sub R, whatever. So that's the way it looks. This is, to get more crazy about it, this is a lattice indicating the different layers that are associated with the 10 classes of signs. And yes, he has his own little set of neologisms. It's nothing you should need to remember, unless you're really interested in this. But there are systems of signs, and they have different functional elements. And they are part of how you could do a kind of logic. It's a little, complicated, and it's not anything that anyone really should need to learn, but it does have a certain consistency to it. So anyway, Charles Sanders Peirce, that's what he looked like. And principles of indexicality, iconicity. Remember I said icon, index, and symbols. Now you can't reduce everything to those things, even though I just showed you some reduced visual versions of them, but they include a lot of other meaning. Iconography, if you're in a medieval church, and you're in medieval times, as it were, that's where God is. And God comes through the church through the icons. I mean, that's, as I say in other lectures, icons are the fax machine to God. And much like the Pope is in the Catholic context, there's some sort of conduit transmits that, but there's some iconicity involved in Il Papa, etc. So that's icons. So indexical signs reflect a more general principle whereby things that are contiguous, that is, things that are sort of near each other, can stand for each other. So you have the relative substitution that's possible, but that it's not necessarily identity. Whereas in iconic signs reflect a more general principle as using an image for the real thing. That, and the little garbage can that you drag the file into, that's trash, right? You're getting rid of something. So there's a little icon called with a little that looks like at least an American garbage can, doesn't look like a British wheelie bin. Symbolic signs allow the human mind to go beyond the limitations of contiguity and similarity, because icons are similar, indexes are contiguous, and establish symbolic links between any form and any meaning. And that, and they are variable in that sense. So the American flag has that problematic component. That is, it can be burned or shouldn't be burned. If you put them upside down, that is a indexical transformation that you've made with the flag itself, and which symbolizes something different. And of course, it's problematic because it's using a symbol in an indexical way. So that even makes people even more nuts, as we've recently seen. And it can get even crazier if you talk about not the written things or visual things, but rather sound itself. So you can apply this in perhaps things that are created as music, but maybe just sounds themselves. So, notification sounds that go bing or bong or whatever are kind of examples of that kind of thing. There is discussion in the literature of indexical order, and it is the idea that you can talk about these the cyclical nature of indices, and that's the point where it links into the issue of surplus value, of the idea that value is produced, the value form is produced in the context of circuits of capital. That's got to move around, in other words, and so it has indexicality in that sense, that it is proximal but not identical to certain things, so that capital has an indexical quality. Now, there's not a lot of literature on that, and I'm the one who wants to try and make it so. So there are indexical cycles. Each example is different in specifics, but follow a general pattern. That's no different than Marx in Volume 2, talking about circuits of capital. Sedimentation of old meanings which fade or are related to the new meanings and give them their topography. Now, that's important because topography suggests that there's a certain space and time over which or around which or somehow in space as topology, the question of meaning that is broader than synchronic. That is, there's an asynchronous component to this, that it's something, or in linguistics, it's the diachronic as opposed to the synchronic. Anyway, and by this one guy, Silverstein talks about it as a spiral path. Now, what other things have we talked about in spiral path? Of course, we talked about dialectics in that same way. We talked about capital in that same way, these kind of the spiral development of the mode of production. So indexical field is a constellation of ideologically related meanings, any one of which can be activated in the situated use of the variable. And this is that same thing, like the web of nature. All these things are kind of interconnected, and it can be problematic, of course, in a sustainable way, similar to Marx's own interest in nature and in science, to say, well, these things are connected, and nature's relation to humans, etc. These are all connected, but in kind of variable and weird ways, and making them sustainable creates conflict or whatever. So anyway, in other fields, like in database stuff, there can be an indexing layer. This is for specifically content management systems and how you organize certain types of databases. There's social indexicality. I know this is just adding more jargon on the one hand, but this is technical. And represents a certain way in which we think about things like social hierarchies and stuff. So these things do exist, and they can be divided in ways that are either internal, external, as we just were looking at yesterday about endogenous versus exogenous, right? So things that occur more internally, or some that are mediated, that are indirect. And this dual nature is exactly what we've been talking about in terms of a kind of dialectical approach to how we talk about capital and money and all that stuff. The mode of production in that sense has, I would assert, indexicality. All right, in database systems, data structures are combined in certain ways, and there are optimized ways of connecting things. That is, if you're doing searches from one thing to get to another thing, or you're getting things to coordinate out of a database. And so without getting too hairy about this, an index is a discussion of a data structure to improve the speed of data retrieval from databases. So it has a relationship to that, but also as a Boolean relationship if you're into that sort of thing as well. So indexicals, these are more new terms, but deixis is used to point people. That is, if I point my finger at me, myself, or you, that's an indexical relation. And note, of course, its indexicality is, it involves direction, involves location, could even involve in temporal dexis, that is location and time, is now or then. And this is the way we talk in language, right? We determine, and this exists in many different languages, and there are multiple ways of describing things that are above, around, under, over, left, right, later, yesterday, tomorrow, the week from Thursday, whatever. There's certain indexicality. It is a context-driven idea, not unlike what we've been looking at in terms of capital. That is, circuits of capital are large bodies or databases of context. And I won't repeat this entire business here on how to define indexical, the difference between indexical and indexically. This is so typical of people in language people, and particularly English grammarian types. This is, this is if you're really nuts about the language police. But it divides the difference between how you apply how you apply the pragmatics of indexical. So I won't repeat all this, but I just gave you some examples. And here are some other examples. I'm going to the store. I is indexical because it refers to the speaker. This is my book. In this sentence, the word my is indexical because it refers to the speaker's possession. Now you can see this has implications about property if we talk about surplus value. Here is your coffee. The word here is indexical because it refers to the location of the coffee. We're meeting at 3 p.m. The word we is indexical because it refers to a specific group of people. She is coming to the party. In this sentence, the word she is indexical because it refers to a specific person. And you can see how complicated this is in gender politics, right? Right? That misgendering people or going to gender fluidity or whatever, they're just, they're just problems there. Let's put it that way. And in terms of it is indexicality is embodied in the pronoun preference. That is his car. In this sentence, the word his is indexical, but refers to the possession. I'll do it tomorrow. This is where I live. You can do it. They're coming with us. He spoke indexically, referring to himself. In this sentence, the word indexically is used to describe how the speaker referred to himself. She wrote the email indexically using personal pronouns. In this sentence, the word indexically is used to describe how the writer used personal pronouns to refer to herself. The map was indexically marked with the location of the treasure. In this sentence, the word indexically is used to describe how the map was marked with the location of the treasure. You can imagine that X does not always mark the spot for a treasure, right? And you can have other indexical elements. And it's certainly clear that in game design, that's kind of what goes on. Certain types of games are, sort of work with that kind of set of issues. So anyway, this has examples, and I think hopefully with the examples that I use that you can apply these in a variety of ways. So basically, there is a kind of grammar that that purports to be generalizable or universalizable. So this is a universal, something that is broadly applied or applied everywhere, absolutely, and particulars. That is, things that you sort of focus on that are also indexical. That is, it's over here, it's over there, it's mine, it's yours, it's, it'll be mine tomorrow. That gets it even more complicated. And every language, I would assert, has some of these kinds of elements. Some are much more complicated. Where one thing one pictogram, for example, equals 4 different things, and it depends on context which of the 4 you're referring to. So ma, for example, can be a horse, but it can also be something else. Similarly, these can also be called relational or reflective things, and there's just all kinds of little disciplines and theories and fields that cover this, and sort of the history of social science, that is the study of all of human interaction and relations, has had a significant activity in all of these things. So here's an example that includes lots of French stuff, Pierre Bourdieu's work, among others. But these are they're consistent. They're just not big words applied to things as labels, but rather they do express a certain set of ideas. Similarly, this is indexicality, and this is just one version of indexicality, and it's the application in a very specific language, but it shows that certain things can be have a kind of layered meaning, and I would assert to you that surplus value has that same kind of thing. So a sociolinguistic example, this is Michael Silverstein's work mentioned above, that identity can be applied. So therefore, to use the pronoun example, this has a much greater set of contexts. So why have I introduced this kind of idea? Well, I introduced this idea just to remind me that there's other idiocy I know and I'm interested in, but also because there is a semiotics of money. And if ultimately we're going to trail back eventually to modern money theory. It's really a long way to get there, but money is like language in that sense. It has symbolic elements in it. It has iconic elements built in it, and it has indexicality. So all of those meanings are kind of built into the theory of capital. Capital is not just one thing, it is a combination of things and a combination of functions or whatever. And, these money meanings are actually really important. Remember that modern money theory is endogenous, that it's talking about the internal operation of things that are not necessarily the central bank, but perhaps more regional relations of the application of money, flows of money, as opposed to a central bank. So it's a matter of emphasis, as it were. One is more external than the other, and this distinction of endogenous versus exogenous is just, it could be simply a point of view problem, but in many ways it also has policy implications because it tells us something about what money is or how money should be used and its relationship to the public, the private, or the people and corporations and the state. So you sort of want to think about what these interactions and relations are and why that has an implication for the regulation of an operation of the money supply as a combination of things, that is a store of value, a medium of exchange, etc. I would assert to you that capital has indexicality because it is all of those things, right? And it has even more ways of defining to be categorized. That is industrial capital, merchant capital, financial capital. There's these layers of meaning that I think are really important. And for the Marxian position, it's to try and estimate where the where is justice in all this? Where is inequality? Is it simply a distributional problem, or does it have other things going on with it, like power, for example? And you can see, hopefully, obviously, that does exist, right? So if you open up the Fortune 500 or whatever, you can see that there is an inequality. If half the population is female, you see that it is not fully represented in the Fortune 500. I mean, it just isn't. You open up an issue of Fortune magazine, and you can just see they have an entire page of all the CEOs, and you go, if the general population is 50% male and female, how come that's not reflected in that particular set of images? Similarly, in Congress, right? It's not 50-50, and it's asymmetric in a certain direction, which is also very interesting. We have other issues about that, and it reflects itself top to bottom, right? People who scare other people by saying they're reading children's stories to children in libraries, but they look like clowns. And so therefore drag queens are a danger, whatever. But and drag queens are a very small subset of the larger LGBTIQA community. But and that community on toto is only a very small proportion of the population. And Kinsey says whatever it is, 5%, 7%, probably a lot higher than that, actually, in reality. But the statistics or the census, sort of whatever, and so if you look at the trans part of the population, it's 0.6%, or no, 0.6%. That is a 0.6 of 1% of the total U.S. population is trans. So therefore, there's such a danger, and we should discriminate against them and wipe them out and blah, 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 blah. You can see how absurd, and that scapegoating is simply built on this threat of 0.6 of the population. Whatever. And it's used, obviously, in differential ways. So the point here is that I've included a range of interrelated things. Yesterday, I introduced an article that talks about money relative to democratic institutions as a kind of, as money as a technology. So therefore, it has a certain kind of instrumental relationship. And you want to sort of work out, well, what does that mean? Because technology can be anything, right? A hammer is a technology, right? Your hand is a technology. There's a range of kind of things under which we have to talk about this. So introducing a kind of idea, a metaphor like money as a technology doesn't perhaps help us that much, but it does open up a certain question about, well, what is our kind of feeling about technology, and why would we call something, for example, techno-feudalism? What would that mean once you start putting all these things together? And does that really give us, does that have any sort of useful critical power? That's a whole other question. So semiotics functions in the same way. Some people just cannot accept that degree of abstraction, the basic sort of abstraction, that the world does have these kinds of shapes, forms, structures, commonalities that are helpful in analyzing things, and they're just one of many that are just available to us because of language. And so anyway, I finally came across this 2014 article, which is not that great an article. I mean, in terms of, it's sort of workmanlike, very clerk-like, in the sense of trying to say, well, money is about communication, and there's sort of a kind of plugs it in a relatively standard positivistic way, but at least he acknowledges that there are semiotics and Marxist analysis. So he describes it, for example, here, this is the front end of a presentation that he did for Semiotics Association, which undoubtedly helped him sort of explain what he was doing to his department in Oklahoma. First, a number of scholars such as Rossi Landi and Giorgio Borelli have endeavored to use Marxist analysis. Now, Rossi Landi is sort of a Marxist, but he's not, he's not really upfront of it. I mean, he uses Marxist terms and stuff, but I think he never really, it's just I don't know. It's like being in the, whatever. It's like being a Mason. Have endeavored to use Marxist analysis as a way of to explore the process of semiosis. Now, the Marxist question or its relation to semiotics is not as direct and problematic at various moments in history, but that's the difference between European and American, not unlike in economics, the difference between Anglo-American or American philosophy and European continental philosophy. There's a big difference. While this line of theory is immensely helpful to my own inquiry, my research exists more in the realm of applied semiotics, as though you could fence that shit off. By the end of this presentation, I should be able to provide a number of examples that demonstrate fertile sources for empirical semiotic inquiry. Yes, that's fine. That's kind of what he wants to do. But what I found useful here is that he does the literature review, and that's the big deal at the front end, is to explain some of the background stuff, which I hope hopefully will be interested for you. That, for example, Mark Schell's book is a book on the history of money, and it's really a great book because he covers everything up through, as I recall, I haven't read it in ages. I always forget his name too. He begins with this idea of and so he plays with some really interesting ideas. That is the difference between presence and absence as a form of tyranny in order to effectively talk about this larger money thing. It's really it's really an interesting little, well, it's not little, book. Chakler and Pascalidis, when I say that money speaks, I do not mean to say that it functions as a container for holding other types of signs, such as a coin or reserve note might. Rather, here we are concerned with the way that money's movement sends a message to a receiver. That's what I've been trying to drive home about, that modern money theory has a certain indexicality, and it engages in a dynamic set of relationships. It is communicative in that sense. For example, the cashier is obligated to accept your payment, whether it is in physical cash or electronically using credit and debit cards. It is this form of money, this abstract form of or conveyor of value, that is the focus of this inquiry. Additionally, I do not, he spends a lot of time fencing his argument off. Additionally, I do not mean to argue that all forms of money are equivalent, that there is no important distinction between debit cards and cash. On the contrary, if spending money on a debit card feels different from spending cash, then we would seek to explore that distinction. Well, it is actually. All forms of money, the bills, the coinage, the credit card swipes, are signed vehicles or perhaps signals, and that's a little ambivalent, which point to an abstract form of value, such as the word hello carries similar meanings, whether it is traveling by vibrations in the air, molecules, or electrons moving down a copper wire towards one's telephone. This paper, his paper, is concerned with the communicative power of money as it transmits value, not the physical object that carries or references it. So, it's kind of important to get these things, that the, whether it is about the medium or is it more about the message. And so he does the usual literature review stuff. Semiotic scholarship has also addressed the issue of money, although in ways distinct from the goal of the paper. Working from an economics perspective, Vennerland uses semiotics to examine how different economic schools view the nature of money. Umberto Eco also uses semiotics to define the role of money in Marx's critique of capitalism. To Eco, remember, Eco writes the 14 signs of, or definitions, as it were, for fascism, an incredibly decent little document. To Eco, Marx's description of money's role in society is analogous to the signifier in semiotics literature. Through this research agenda, I intend to explore the various signifieds. According to Marx, the base, and in here he's just oversimplifying its base superstructure, which is really problematic as a model. But anyway, the base, our real relations to society and each other, determines the superstructure, our thoughts and ideas about the nature of society. Additionally, many of linguistic and social features that we consider signs, that is, words for Saussure, myths for Barth, and ideology, hegemony for Gramsci, and a variety of texts, interpolation for Althusser, are aspects of the superstructure. Following Marx and Engels, we must assume that aspects of the base must be antecedent or precede the ideas and processes within the superstructure mentioned above. Or as Schaff explains, the base indirectly determines the superstructure, with humans serving as a mediating factor. That's an interesting way to refer to it. Here is where money is important. And we've, anyway, cash and credit have real buying power, which is relative between individuals. In other words, money is part of the base because it's often the central medium through which we maintain our relationships to each other in society. We've talked about this before in talking in capital. Money is also communicative and sends a message, instigating a change in the recipient. Therefore, if money is part of the base, that it functions as a form of communication, and the base influences the superstructure, then perhaps studying money as communication may be one way to help explain the nature of the sign found in the superstructure. It's really a mechanical version of the argument. This research agenda could provide another tool for discussing Marx's notion that, quote, the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas without having to assume a conspiracy of global economic elites. See, this it's a long way, but that's kind of where he's headed. And that's an interesting objective, but really not a very good goal. To reiterate, for the scope of this presentation, this is just a paper, so it's not all finished. He just wanted to touch all the bases in case anyone started arguing with him. I think this is the thing about conference papers. To reiterate, for the scope of this presentation, one should assume the following perspective. First, that money is a form of abstract value that can be held in a number of forms. Second, that the abstract value has definite observable communicative functions. And third, that our social interactions that involve this abstract value have the potential to influence the way that we see the world. There's a lot of things going on here. And, the point is, as I mentioned yesterday, it's about information. It is problematic in terms of measurement. It is a common resource, and it has property relations. It has certain kinds of things that create problematic value, that are power relations, as it were, of which intellectual property rights are a very interesting example. And as modern money theory says, money is created endogenously by the banking sector, more regionally divided, et cetera, rather than exogenously by central bank lending. It is the difference between lending and distribution is actually an important thing. A continuation of a process of production within the process of circulation and for the process of circulation. So it is functionally related in that sense. And within current debates around the production of value under capitalism, it's useful to make an explicit conceptual distinction between where surplus value is produced and where it's extracted, which was the key point that I wanted to make at the whole front end. And that I hope that people have been appreciating that surplus value has a relationship to labor and labor power, more specifically, and its relation, it's the measurement of it as where it's located is widely discussed and problematic for many people. Marx sort of focusing, because of the productivist bias in Department 1, that there's this emphasis on the production sector as opposed to distributional issues, which is where kind of all of people after Marx kind of went, well, it's not always in production. And in fact, surplus value is sort of part of this abstraction process, and it's really more part of distribution, and that it represents certain abstract values or relations that, as I have said, that are not congealable. You can't reify them. It's hard to reify. Not that they can't be, but it's really more difficult to measure because you need to be very, very careful about what that surplus value is and its relation to how you discuss the larger sets of questions. So, for example, to use a very specific example, distributive justice, has value built into it, but it is this question of, if you're going to have distributive justice, how do you measure it? What values are you looking at? Is its relationship, how is it that you create equity in that particular sense? And at some moment, you have to imply how it's going to happen, how it unfolds over time, where it sits in history, et cetera. And that's really difficult for some people who argue for a kind of distributive justice. Anyway. And so at the end of my little yakking here, I'm at the end of my yakking, and of course, my voice has gone out. I have come across something that combines partially, it's maybe perhaps more metaphorical, but I've added a video at the end that is a discussion about digital photography and the difference between digital and analog photography, that's made in an argument here about indexicality, that that there's the claim in here is a problematic one. That is, because we now have digital photography and we do very little analog photography, that digital photography does not have indexicality in it. I would assert that it does, but it's a kind of stupid argument. But the fact is, indexicality can be argued in the photograph because it's always a reflection or distortion, however you want to describe it, whether it's analog or digital, of a kind of reality. And so, and largely essentialist, in the sense that in the analog photography, that is in chemical photography, you're creating latent images by a photochemical reaction with light. Whereas in digital photography, you're doing a kind of sensorial acquisition of light that does not form a latent image, but rather is digitally constituted, which is not new. That is the halftone, for example, which has been in printing technology for X number of years, at least, 150 at least, 180 actually years, is essentially pre-digital, digital photography, but that's a whole nother argument. Anyway, the point being is that he goes through a little discussion here, and he's attacking somebody else's article, and which makes not a whole bunch of sense, but it's useful to explicate the argument, which is made slightly better by talking about theorizing animation as an evolving configuration of media epistemology and aesthetic practices in a global context. That is, inaccurate association of the indexical sign with the mechanical process, photographic reproduction, constrains the possibility of theorizing animation as an evolving configuration of epistemology and aesthetic practice. So in a dialectical way, animation or cinema or video or whatever, moving images probably have more indexicality, or at least you can explain indexicality a little easier, which essentially proves the point I started out with, that is that it is circulation in motion that allows us to discuss the formation of surplus value in this particular movement from Department 1 to Department 2. That's a fuckload of meandering, but I like to think it has certain logical consistency. So at the end of all this yakking, I'm going to stop, and you can talk and ask questions and intervene. Let me note, of course, that tonight there is, we haven't really decided, but it would be nice to watch the debates together. And my peculiar obsession is to watch the analysis, either the front end where they predict what they think is going to happen, or afterwards, which is better because you have all the mistakes and all the spinning in the spin room, et cetera. I don't even know if there's going to be a spin room. That should be interesting in and of itself. So anyway, that's what tonight it's scheduled 9:00 Eastern time, but they're starting coverage 2 hours before and probably 2 hours after, at least on MSNBC. No questions. I put everyone to sleep. Everyone is sleeping. I chased everyone away. No, there's pretty much the same crowd here. Uh no questions.
Hey,
Well,
Ann,
yeah,
it's Joe here.
yeah.
I, talking about signs, I'm stuck in the bathroom scrubbing it down. Got a load of black mold. What kind of index is that? Sorry, I'm a bit
Well,
tied up. Otherwise, I come with a better question.
actually, a cough would be a index. For me, a cough, some sort of deadly tuberculosis or cough, would be the index of what the black mold itself looks like. Yes, I have a similar issue. Black mold. You
I
know, it
just have a
just means.
dumb question. The basic definition of semiotics, and I may have missed this, but for the lay person.
Basic definition. The thing about, well, there are sign systems initially in their first kind of analysis are an attempt to create a cultural science. That is, it is how we communicate with signs. That is, whether it's letter forms or gestures, sign language, for example.
Right. So it's the study of symbols or symbology. Or how is it different? How are signs different than symbols? Or are they essentially
symbols are signs?
They're
the generic.
Those two things are interchangeable. Okay.
Right. Well, not perfectly
or not.
interchangeable.
Not all symbols are signs. Not all signs.
The big definition. Everything is signs. Symbols are a complex version of signs. There are icons that are signs because they directly represent the thing they're supposed to be. That is, the Russian icons are not just pictures of saints. They are holy. They're the fax machine to God. I mean, you treat it as a sacred object.
Right, it's a sacred object.
As opposed to Protestant churches where, there's a cross, that's fine. You can even set them on fire if you want to scare black people. So, obviously it doesn't have that kind of same holy element to it, right? So that's icons or signs. Indexes of signs are more indirect. They require a kind of, you have to think about it. That is you're walking in the snow, or the treads that your tires make are not the car itself, but they tell you something car-like was there. Now it could be simply that you have shoes that have treads.
Footprints are signs.
Yes. Everything is a sign. Right. Everything are signs. The symbols are signs that are just complicated. The American flag is a symbol. It's a sign in the sense, if you flip it upside down, you create indexicality, right? And what's problematic, and which I would point out to whoever is writing about it, that you only put this technical sign. Flipping the sign up, the flag upside down, is a sign of distress only for boats. If you're on a boat or a ship, that's when you put your sign. It's part of maritime law. The flipping your national flag upside down is a sign of distress, as opposed to idiots who do it, on their lawns or whatever.
Right, but it's been adopted that idea has then been adopted by certain members of the Supreme Court to also mean a country in distress or a nation in distress.
Yeah, but that's it's a very specific ideological kind of appropriation, because for example, Reader's Digest in those heady days of the New Left used to include window decals of the American flag in their they give them away free, and then a lot of leftists would post them upside down on their car windows, right? So this practice of country in distress has been there for quite a while. So it's nothing new, and it's not very outrageous. It's just dopey behavior. But anyway, that's
right, because the sign, right, a flag flying upside down aboard a vessel is a specific thing saying, not only am I in distress, but please come help me. It's basically a call for help of a sense.
That's right. It's Mayday. It's like saying
it's not
Mayday.
Just right. It's not just making a statement. You're not just making a statement. Yeah, that's
right. That's right. And it gets problematic because if you burn a flag, particularly in a democracy, the whole point is to burn a flag should not be criminal, because the whole point of democracy is to protect your right to burn the fucking flag.
Right. Yep.
But you have assholes who want to create these flag laws, and it is in flag etiquette. If it hits the ground, you got to burn it, and you can go.
Right.
No, it's not that sacred. It's just a piece of fucking cloth. It stands for liberty. It stands for democracy. It stands for our respecting each other.
Well, yeah, or maybe it just stands for the United States of America. I mean, again, what you're saying is what you imbue it with. To me, it doesn't. To me, it stands for this country. It doesn't. I wouldn't think of burning it. I wouldn't think of. So I did get a flag. I got the flag when my father died, and he was in the Navy. I did get the flag, the properly folded flag, and I still have it.
Yes.
I have never unfolded it. I leave it. I don't honestly know what to do with it. I could get one of those
triangular
cases.
Boxes. Those
boxes,
I
can put that, but I don't feel a particular desire to display it. But I do respect it enough to just keep it with me, I guess.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
it's important. That's not to say that flags are, reducible to those things. It's just that we need to sort of go beyond the material. There's something more to it than that. For example, my counterexample or my problematic example that I pose to students is if I have a flag made before Hawaii and Alaska became a state and I burn it, I shouldn't be prosecuted at all because it's not even an authentic American flag, right?
It's not even, yes.
It's a 48-star, flag.
Right. It's a historic object or a period object. I mean, right, exactly.
I mean, I would do that to just fuck with people at, events where people would get pissed off at something like that. Oh, no, it wasn't an American flag. It's a pre-50 state flag,
Right. Betsy Ross, you could burn the Betsy Ross flag.
Indeed. Well, and then you could see how sacred they pick other kinds of flags, right? They use the 13-star flag in order to make a certain argument. And then there's that whole idiocy about flags that don't step on snakes or whatever.
Well,
You're breaking up. Anyway, it's commodity fetishism. Let's just put it that way. Anybody else?
A couple questions or points. Living in the Euro sector, Scandinavia, and in Europe, I noticed a reliance on more symbols, signage without words. Iconography reigns supreme.
Yes, it's so European.
That would have to do with nations or regions that are multilingual, I would assume.
Yes.
So is that just a practical thing?
Yes.
Because I noticed in the States it's a lot of words, but coming here, I live with the graphic designer, so I'm very
Yes.
fortunate because I don't understand half of them, especially especially in manuals, and I need
God.
help translating these actual words. And I'm wondering, is this just bad design or it's just like reduced too much to simplicity that I can't grasp it? Are there people who have the
No,
inability to grasp iconography?
it presumes more indexical, knowledge or practice by the reader of the manual. Let's put it that way. And you sort of assume that there are more cognates and stuff that could help you trundle through the language, but it's really quite impossible. It is the major difficulty of manuals, I guess. Fortunately, we have AI to help us out, right?
I was
manuals
hoping it was just I was hoping it was just graphic designers who haven't worked with their hands.
Well, graphic designers, that's how they make their money. You got to make new systems. That's a big, it's a European, I mean, it's modern design, and the Americans are deal with it as well. It just gets more complicated when you have kind of a regulation. The problem of bilingual stuff in Canada makes signs really complicated, right? They're in, French or English, and then it makes it, you have to have.
I have to admit, moving through space over on this side of the pond is much more. It feels more aesthetically pleasing and satisfying, even if I'm totally confused and don't know where the hell I'm going or what I'm supposed to do.
Well, it is very
wonderful
dangerous.
Design.
Yes, but it can be dangerous. It's like and there are things that are very anyway. This is like I'm teaching classes again, but in my brief time in England, I nearly get hit by cars because I look left then right as opposed to right then left when crossing a street, and that can just kill you. You can literally kill you. That is your first move of your head.
Well, the most important thing is to make sure you're in the zebra walk.
Absolutely. But
otherwise you're fair game.
Yes, that's true too. And but there's an instance where you don't have signs, although the zebra walk is a sign.
Yeah, that happened to me when I was in Montreal.
Ah, yes.
I was in the subway and somehow we got turned around or something the wrong way inside the subway station. And we're looking for the way out, and there's this set of double doors, and there's a sign on them. And we could not tell what the hell it was supposed to be saying. So we went out there, and as soon as we opened the door, an alarm goes off.
Jamal Bowman. It's the Jamal Bowman problem.
And so there was a camera there on the door, and we just put our hands up in the air and like, sorry. You might want to put it in English.
Yanks, darn Yanks.
I mean, some of the signs, they had French and then in small.
Yes, the English.
font.
That's right. In Quebec, in Quebec, they're quite, whatever, francophonic or.
Right. That was not the case in that situation.
No, that's a whole other political issue.
And just in relation to your talk in general, I just wanted to let you know that I saw the sign and it opened up my mind.
I saw the sign. Signs everywhere a sign. Oh, God. Anyway, it's not to all make you semioticians, but people should appreciate that there are systemic constructions of things that exist already in the world. I mean, that's part of anthropology, is to identify, these different sign systems, which are problematic in many ways. Some of which are obvious, some of which are quite opaque, So anyway, thank you for your attention. I went over again. I try not to, but anyway, we can have now the discussion of where the hell are we going to watch the debate, and are we going to have a drinking game? We shouldn't, because we'll all be very drunk if we try to, every time Trump says a lie, we're going to be dead and alcohol poisoning or something.
Well, that might be the best outcome if he wins the debate.
Indeed.
Every time the word migrant is spoken,
oh man,
you have to take a drink.
I'm going to be in trouble. Yeah, no drinking games.
It's going to be all about the migrants and how they're poisoning our blood.
Oh, that's what's poisoning my blood.
Yes, it's people you've never met and you'll never actually ever meet. They're the real
Right.
problem.
I mean, people in Iowa are very concerned about immigration.
They are.
Is that the topic of Biden's Marxist lecture this evening?
Marxist lecture.
And I wonder what the debate rules will be, whether it's going to be 3 minutes, for whatever they're going to say, and then there's a 1 minute rebuttal and blah, blah, blah. They're going to cut the mics exactly on time. That should be.
They're going to cut the mics, but I think Trump will be loud enough that you'll still hear him on Biden's mic. That's my prediction.
Yeah. He just keep yammering.
Yeah, he won't stop.
A lot of splitting of hairs on the value of human life is what I would imagine would be going on.
Yeah.
Value of human life. They're not even. I guarantee you. Here's the thing. I bet Gaza and what's going on in Israel will barely be a topic. That's my prediction.
Yeah, it's a minefield. It's a fucking minefield.
I mean, it wasn't last time.
Well, but
foreign affairs in general are never. It's going to be the economy, immigration, why people don't feel present. People don't. They say that the economy is getting better, but people don't feel it. What are you going to do about that, Mr. President?
Jesus. All right. Well, thanks for listening to my yammering here. It was a little technical, but I put enough there, hopefully, so that you can go back in and look up the words that that you have trouble with. Otherwise, thank you very much. Tomorrow will not be quite as technical. I guess I have a different thing I want to do tomorrow, and be there, be square. The next thing in the evening probably will be our collective watching of debate coverage, I hope. I'm more fascinated with the analysis, but I mean, the debate itself will be probably